Hello, everyone. You may have noticed that this looks a little bit different at the moment. My MacBook just crashed during the last break, so sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and try to fix it while we get on with our next talk. And our next speaker is Frances Gordon. She's a content designer and trainer who focuses on clarity and innovation. She runs Simplified, which is a consultancy offering support with strategy and training and making complex content sound clear. Before that, she worked developing education content for people in rural sub-Saharan Africa. Today, Frances offers us a bigger picture when considering our plan for distributing content and making sure it's useful for the people who need it most. She'll introduce us to some cognitive biases, things that we're probably all prone to from time to time, and take a look at how we can better conceptualize content for tomorrow's world. Put your questions in the chat on Veto as always, and over now to Frances to share her experience of how to avoid cultural assumptions when creating content.
Hi everybody, hopefully that's a little bit better now. You should be able to see me. So thanks so much for the introduction, Mike, and sorry that I didn't think of unmuting myself a bit earlier. So I'm talking about being curious about content in context and avoiding assumptions. No, sorry, I'm also having for some reason, having some technical problems. So sorry about this. If that's going to work. Yes. Right. So hopefully we can get going now. I asked a curious question, and my take on this brief was to go quite philosophical. So I'm going to ask you to leave behind some of the more technical and directly practical thinking we've been doing, and we're going to think more conceptually. So as a content strategist, my role is to try to make content easy to use, easy to govern, and easy to chop up and then reconstruct at will for an infinite variety of contexts and devices and use cases. In addition to developing a great UX, our goals are often commercial. We want to match content and the structure that governs it to commercial metrics. We need to generate return on investment. My curious question is, what if our desire to design simpler systems becomes a barrier to appreciating the diversity of content in context, of content in the real world? What if we looking at the wrong inputs, so we get the wrong outputs and we design the wrong systems? Will we choose the wrong signs and in so doing construct the wrong road? I've spent my life and my career crisscrossing continents between Africa and Europe. And I think we might be missing the complex contexts of content in our increasingly diverse worlds. My first content job was when I was 18 years old, writing IOUs for a payday loan scheme that my father ran in one of the tiniest, poorest, but most beautiful countries in the world, Lesotho. Since then, I've worked with large corporations like Barclaycard and NS&I, and I've also worked in fintech in frontier markets. And what I want us to do is to put aside our best practice tools and take out our ethnographer's eyes and look at our cultural and linguistics contexts with the awareness of our biases. My presentation talks about content in South Africa and Nigeria, because I think it's sometimes interesting to think about content in unfamiliar contexts. My aim is to challenge and hopefully inspire you to think with the eyes of ethnographers and come up with a challenging view on your own content. So there's three kind of things we're going to look at, things we're going to be explorers in. The first is around the context of the services, the genres that we communicate in. The second, how people, real people in the real world use that information. And then the third is my favorite area, because I'm a linguist by background, is around our biases that we may show around language and the ethics of language diversity. So I'm starting off with an example of an assumption. It's quite a specific example, but I often see this type of assumption used. And this assumption is that information about insurance, about a specific financial product, about insurance, will map into the broader genre of financial services. So it kind of feels common sense. And the bias that the very clever cognitive bias psychologists talk about here is anchoring. When we over-rely on the first piece of information we get, and then we always use it as the baseline of comparison. So we never try something new because we've relied on that. Insurance is a financial service and it'll belong within that genre. But when we go into the real world, in an unfamiliar context in South Africa, we find financial services not only on financial services websites, but we find them on football websites. So this is Kaizer Chiefs, the football club, not Kaizer Chiefs, the pop group. and when people are looking at football content and looking at their players in WhatsApp groups and on the website, that's where they will come across an insurance product. So there's far more of an impact on white labeling insurance products and using something aspirational like a sport, a football club, to present it. So our whole genre is completely different to the way we think. And we have to think in terms of what genre our users are thinking about our services in. Sometimes we start off with tasks, and I think that's a bit late. We also go outside the digital world and we find out where people are selling insurance. And we find that at shop fronts, shops are selling insurance and people are buying insurance next to their mobile phone data. So they'll buy, £2 worth of data, and then they'll buy a £2 worth of a funeral policy, which is a funeral policy is a kind of very cheap kind of life policy, and that it's just there to pay for your funeral. That's what the insurance is for. So it works exactly like a prepaid data in that you buy it and it'll insure you for a month, and then you'll buy another one and you'll get another month. So our whole mental model for a service is different. I've seen, interestingly, this kind of is happening now in sub-Saharan Africa with the new interest in healthcare and in health policies. We're finding prepaid health policies. So even getting medical aid, if you don't want to go to the equivalent of the NHS, you would pay for that also, more like a mental model of mobile data. So we need to look at these kind of genres. Let's move into how this information is used and some interesting assumptions around digital accessibility that I hear quite often. So here's an example. Information about our insurance service that we're doing will be on a responsive website, and we'll transact on an app. And we kind of say to ourselves, well, I hear my people saying, it'll be fine because we're going to make this accessible. We're going to follow WCAG and we're going to make it inclusive. And I think the bias that we sometimes fall into here, they're called the choice supportive bias, which is once a decision is made, people tend to over-focus on the benefits and minimize the flaws. So we say, well, it kind of works at the moment. It must be working. That's great. Let's carry on down this path. And we don't reevaluate. So one part of reevaluating, again, is to move outside of the digital context, outside of the kind of website context or the app context, and look on the streets. And this is an interesting artwork. It's street art from Cape Town, and it's street art on the wall of a shell of a house. So there's nothing kind of behind here. And so it's on the shell of a house. And it used to, when I asked what it used to be where the van came with the books and they would lend the books to all the children in this quite poor community. So it was a mobile library, not on the phone mobile, but a mobile library. And that has stopped now. And what this artist, I think, was trying to say is now people will use an Apple Mac and an iPad. And isn't that an interesting bias that we have? Perhaps because we learned to go from books to Macs and iPads, because the reality is in communities like these, there are no Apple Macs. There are only feature phones and maybe very basic smartphones. There are no iPads. There may only be very, very basic Androids. And why is this? Well, across the African continent, it's all about data costs. So 1 gigabyte of data costs on average 7% of users' average monthly salary, the equivalent of $373 for North Americans. And this problem of data cost, of course, is not just an African problem. And it's really interesting to look at all your contexts of data costs. Also, mobile phone coverage is scatty and that depends on mobile provider. So you kind of need multiple SIM cards because you need one for this provider and one for that provider because the coverage kind of changes. So when we actually look at what happens, it makes perfect sense. Families and communities share and swap phones according to need. So you might have that phone on the left, which is a kind of a smart feature phone. So it'll be kind of a smartphone, but it'll only have WhatsApp, YouTube, and Facebook. That's it. That's all it's going to have. It's not going to let you browse. Then you might have your WhatsApp phone where you use for all your WhatsApp things. And then you might have just a feature phone and you can do quite a lot. There are lots of services that you can do on a feature phone and you're going to kind of swap these around. You also will have your multiple SIM cards that will be swapped around. So you can see the very starting points of some of our assumptions we make around biometrics and singular ownership of phones, that this world we're moving into on biometrics and links to credit scores and all of that, they pose fundamental issues to problems of access. As do simpler things like video content is a problem to access. Unless you use a messaging app or your users use a messaging app that doesn't charge for file transfer. So there's a lot of inbuilt biases that we have before we, I think, as content strategists and information architects, even start our work. Another really interesting thing, this is a true story that happened to me, is I was testing a mobile, it was a responsive website on a mobile phone, and it was in a poor area. And these users were given the phones. It's a really false test. They were given the phones for me to test the services on. But when I went to visit them, they were working on paper. And I said, but let's do it on the phone. They had to calculate interest and things like that. And the reason they were doing it on paper was nothing to do with the fact that they didn't know how the phone worked or being intimidated. That wasn't it. It was this issue. There was no electricity. And so they had to use solar. In their village, they used solar panels hooked up to batteries to charge mobile phones. So this meant that your chance to charge only came around once in a while. So boy, you used your phone as little as possible because you need to keep the charge in the phone. You didn't want to waste that charge. So these types of assumptions we make when we talk about digital accessibility are really interesting. And again, when I've started to look at accessibility, even within the first world, I see little remnants of these same problems. Another thing that I like talking about is motivation, because there are so many biases that we have that I'm told about motivation. One example is, because I as Mike alluded to, I work a lot with clear information. So I write a lot of financial terms and conditions. And I'm really often told, well, nobody wants to read these terms and conditions. Motivation is just too low. And especially when somebody has a low literacy, they just definitely don't want to read it, I'm told. And I think this is what the psychologists call the halo effect. So people of low literacy, they won't want to read a lot of text. It's also kind of putting your own feelings onto other people. what I'm going to say now might be a bit controversial, but this is honestly what I feel. I've user tested financial terms and conditions in very diverse contexts. And when I speak to stakeholders, I'm usually told something like this. At the end of the day, after I've kind of motivated, we must change it, we must improve it, we must put it in plain language. Often when it comes to the legal content, I'm told things like users won't read this anyway. And I'm often told this by lawyers, and they'll go, even we wouldn't read it. Even we wouldn't read it. I'm actually also told that sometimes by UX professionals and content strategists, they just think nobody's interested in this. It's really boring to read this, and we must make it short. No one wants to read it. Whereas the truth is, the more vulnerable people I speak to and I test, the more they want to read these terms and conditions. And I think what it is it's about when you don't trust the system to rescue you. Especially, I think maybe the deciding factor is if you've lost a breadwinner in your family when you're a child, and you grow up knowing that the system might not be there for you, then you really want to read the terms and conditions. You have an incredibly high motivation and you put an incredible amount of effort into reading these terms and conditions. So often we have this assumption that we're writing terms and conditions for high literacy groups, but actually we're writing them for vulnerable people that often have a lower literacy. So it's an assumption we need to kind of look at. The other assumption that I find really happens quite a lot is this assumption. If you don't read well, then you won't be an expert at content. And if you're poor, you will have low financial literacy. And again, it's the halo bias. It's saying if you have low literacy in reading, you're going to have low understanding and you're going to have low financial literacy. And it's an incredibly powerful assumption and which comes from this cognitive bias. And what I like to do is to draw a continuum of low level of expertise and high level of expertise. Because as a content strategist, what you're often saying is if somebody is a low level expertise, you'll have to give examples, you'll give background, you'll give definitions, you'll have to just give a lot of content. We often think people with a high level of expertise, perhaps we can use those specialized terms and we can use that jargon because that's the shortcut between experts. We can often be shorter. So it's really interesting when you start to break down what we are an expert at. One of the most interesting things that I find, well, I'll start from the bottom up. So the first one is USSD, a USSD phone, a feature phone. When we're using multiple devices, everybody knows what USSD versus WhatsApp versus WeShare is. But I find in the UK, not many people know that word, and you'd have to be a bit of an expert, a bit of a geek to know what USSD is. So your levels of expertise are surprising. The level of expertise around budgeting shouldn't be surprising, but they are. And again, I find when we're writing plain language, there's an assumption underneath it that, again, if you're poor, you might need help with budgeting. And the truth is that unless there's been an event that you've had problems with, very, very often, if you grow up poor, the one thing that you do know about is budgeting. So you actually are an expert at budgeting. You might not use a spreadsheet, but you know budgeting. And if you understand your users as knowing about budgeting and you can speak in their language, speak to them as experts because they are, you get far better results because we haven't made this assumption, this condescending assumption. It's a similar point with interest. And this is one not with rich and poor or vulnerable and not. It's one around, just around, I think, well, I find the UK versus Africa. And I worked for a credit company for a couple of years in London, and we spent a lot of time trying to explain to customers what compound interest is. And we tried in a whole lot of ways to explain it. And it really interested me just how difficult it was for people to understand. Because when I've worked on African projects, people understand interest. People who don't understand maths, haven't had a formal education in maths, they understand interest. And it's a really obvious point. It's because interest rates are 20 times higher. So if interest rates are so high, you very quickly kind of grow up understanding compound interest. It's a very different thing. When it comes to credit scores, that's of course reversed. And there's an incredible expertise around credit scores in the UK, which wouldn't be in Africa. So when we're looking at level of expertise, there's a lot of different parameters we need to look at, and not only at literacy. We need to be careful of that halo effect, where we assume because somebody's bad at one thing, they'll be bad at another thing. This is an interesting one, expertise at reading. And I'm not sure, when I've got here a typical terrible piece of communication from South Africa. This is the kind of stuff we see, and it's sent as a PDF over a phone on WhatsApp as a file, or it's sent as an image, and we just know it's awful. And one of the first things that I always think of why it's awful is I kind of make the assumption that would be better to just have one language. So surely you would choose to have either English or your home language, your mother tongue. And, you know, so why do you want to squash it all into one horrible page? And what I've found when I've user tested is it's so interesting, because a lot of users really do want two languages, and they want them next to each other to compare. The reason is sometimes if you're in a low resource language, sometimes the translations are quite hard to understand. So one that I've come across is the translation for ombudsman, you know, the regulator that's going to be fair and help to resolve disputes in financials. So when you try and when I've seen ombudsman translated into some other tongues in South Africa, it's the translator's gone, well, there's no word for ombudsman in Zulu, so we're going to translate it as the person appointed by the regulator that's going to resolve disputes in your finances. And the person reading that goes, I don't know what that is. What was it in English? And they go, oh, it's an ombudsman. Right, I get it. So there's a kind of such an interesting switch between the two. It's almost like the one covers the holes in the other. We must also remember, we're going to get onto this segue onto language, but we must also remember that many people have very mixed literacy. So they might have learned, gone to school and learned English, whereas their mother tongue is an African language. So there's often kind of a mixed level of literacy between different languages. We're not more literate in our mother tongues than we are in another language. That's another big assumption we tend to make. So we've worked out that people who are low literacy are often experts at working through translations. And it's a good segue into talking about language in a more general way. And the assumption, there's so many assumptions about language I could have chosen, but this is the one I decided to choose because I do kind of a lot of localization work into Africa from the US and from the UK and various other places. And generally, the assumption we make quite quickly is standard English is the best decision. So the debate is limited to UK English or US English. That's the level of our debate. And I think what we're talking about here is a choice supportive bias. This is a bias that says once a decision is made, people tend to overfocus on its benefits and minimize its flaws. So standard English kind of worked, so let's just go with it. It's fine. Everybody else goes with it, so it's fine. And when we're discussing this issue, I always think it's very important to have one slide about history. So sorry, if you hate history, I think it's important to understand our context of our content. We have to look at a little bit of history. And we have to recognize that the slave trade and the scramble for Africa contributed to this linguistic, unique, amazing linguistic diversity that we see in Africa. Because Africa was carved up by European powers that were sorting out their own political battles. And they didn't really care about any culture language splits in Africa. It was split up according to Europe's needs and not according to Africa. So often the borders, country borders, have very little relationship to language borders. So what we have is we have European language and we have thousands of local languages woven together, forming new varieties and new diversities. We also have, because of the slave trade, people with different languages coming together and desperately needing a common language and coming up with what are pidgins, so simplified forms of languages. So we have a diversity that is pretty amazing. There are over 2,000 languages in Africa. However, it's not all around this narrative of there's so many different languages and no one can understand each other, because there can be seen to be 12 African language groups that over 75% of people in this huge continent can understand as a first or additional language. So we need to understand this. We need to look at it in more detail. The interesting thing is that there's one group of business, one area of business that really understands the value of going away from standard English or standard French in French Africa, Francophone Africa, and that's advertisers. Advertisers really know what's going to appeal emotively to users and how important that is. And advertising is really diverse and in many languages. And this is Nando's, who recently had a campaign called Respect Your Tongue when you eat peri-peri chicken. But they've had many campaigns where they are actually being quite activists towards using people's mother tongues. What also happens to languages in Africa, I think, more than languages elsewhere, or I should say language in ex-colonial places more than languages in Europe, is that one language can have many different political and social connotations. And there's so many assumptions that we sometimes have with a particular language. So one example is the Creole of Dutch, the language of apartheid, which was Afrikaans. And in the top left of the screen, you've got the protests that went on in the 1970s against this, what was seen as this apartheid language, this language of oppression. You also just beneath it have a saying, it's now the burden it means. And this saying is from a variety of Afrikaans, which is very much about a variety of the struggle and a variety of criminality and rebellion. In the top right, we have the Afrikaans of the street. So it says the walls speak. And in the bottom right, you have a very interesting one, which is very far from perhaps our initial assumptions or biases towards what we think Afrikaans is, sorry, and that's that some of the very first written records of this Creole, what was a Creole in the 19th century, were actually written in Arabic script, and they were religious interpretations of the Quran. And this was the language spoken when slaves from different places came together to worship. They worshipped in Afrikaans, but in Arabic script. So one language, many different connotations and many different worlds. This sometimes plays out in business too. So here's some recent tweets I took from a financial services site, and they people complaining to a financial services site, and they're really interesting. You can see there's some Igbo, some mother tongue. You can see there's some English. You can see there's some like corporate language. I still cannot do a zip it without getting a corporate language, failed to get a debit account error. And then you get some mother tongue, Kushandisa, USSD, expert at USSD. And then it continues in mother tongue. So this amazing mixture of languages and experts in certain things. What I want to show you is something quite interesting here, is the on the right-hand side, we've got an example of they're talking about finding a way to make cross-border transactions active again for Nigeria. And you can actually see at the bottom line, I'm not going to try and read it, but there's some Pidgin Nigeria in there, and Pidgin Nigeria. And you can see the complete difference, the complete different mental model that this American company who's doing business in Africa communicates. Transfers to Nigeria are currently unavailable. This is based on a recent change in policy. So we see a completely different type of language that I think goes beyond tone and goes to seeming very different to your customers. I wanted to show you this really fun example as well of code switching, because I think it also illustrates just how many assumptions we can make about language in a diverse context. So code switching is what I showed you, where you use you take the syntax of one language and then you stick in words from a third language and words from a fourth language and a little bit from a fifth, and you mix it all kind of together. But there are some almost formalized varieties of code switched languages now. There's also something called borrowed words, and English is really good at this. You know, we take words from different languages to use them, and so we're able to talk about, I suppose, food, you know, because we borrowed so many different words into English. And what I want to show you is how borrowed words can change meaning completely and open up very interesting ways for your content and communication and mental models. So here we have something called pap, and anyone who's traveled in Africa would probably know what pap is. It's like polenta. It's a maize meal. It's a staple starch. So this person's saying, I'm craving, and everybody uses this word pap. No matter what your mother tongue is, you use this word. It's been borrowed into all the different languages. So you're craving pap and yogurt, amasi. That's what it's craving. It's literal. It's a borrowed word, but it's literal. But then there's something very interesting that starts happening when you look at usage of pap. Pap in vlees means the starch in meat. And so this person says something like, it's not, in Afrikaans, pap in vlees, it's not meat and porridge and meat, to run a taxi business, comrade, because it means easy. So pap in vlees is borrowed in, but it's changed its meaning, and now it means easy. So this one, politics, is not pap in vlees. I'm just saying. So words can come in and change language. And what I wanted to show you here is when you go to the biggest corporate brand of porridge, where people are looking on their mobile site, there's all sorts of fancy things you can do. And you get a completely standard English. You get none of these usages that are being used. Interestingly, you also get an image of the pap that isn't particularly how people would typically eat it. But what is interesting again is what I want to show you. Sometimes these Englishes we use are corporate-wise are so different. And often it is because international companies we're not really looking at the users, and it's not so hard to do so. We just need to turn to social media and we can see these amazing things. When I look at another interesting assumption around slang, and I was talking to some colleagues about slang yesterday when I was discussing this presentation, and my one friend said to me, but slang is the same in all different countries. Slang is always a way to identify yourself different to another person. Slang, it's kind of the same for everybody. And I think that's also an assumption, because slang can also be a kind of euphemism. And we saw this a lot when research was done a couple of years ago into how people were referring to HIV/AIDS, because people didn't want to name it, because they needed a euphemism, because there are cultural implications of naming a disease. So you had 5 and 3 = 8. You had the departure lounge. It's awful. You had a tracker. That's an interesting one. So a tracker is the name of software that you put in your car that's going to track your car if it's stolen. But the tracker became to mean a positive AIDS test. So you've been tracked, you've got the tracker. And then also you playing the lotto. So if you got it, you're playing the lotto. and iloto is the word for lotto in South Africa. And so there's a lot of, as I said, research on this. And the idea is that we cannot dismiss slang as something kind of on the side of language, something kind of unimportant, like it might be in certain types of English, because it might have a real cultural significance and importance. It might be a lot more effective to use these kinds of euphemisms, for example, than to use the scientific Western words. Also, what's interesting is Africa's people's attitudes are changing towards these non-standard varieties. So here we have the BBC's service in Pidgin English. And this was just 2 days ago. We've got the story of Elon Musk and the story of Tiger Woods here. So you can see, as in a lot of Creoles, the DEY for they. So there's lots of different attitudes. These attitudes are changing, and we're no longer seeing this idea that these are low prestige. So I'm in the last couple of minutes of this presentation, and I want to challenge us now, because I've talked a lot about biases around language. And the truth is, out of the roughly 6,000 languages in use today, the top 10 make up 82% of the total of the content on the internet. And most of that's English and Chinese and Hindi. There's other French and Portuguese, and some languages go down there, but we've got a very few languages in standard varieties making up most of the web. And we got to think about the implications of this increasing. And people are starting to speak about what AI in language, because we all know that AI is going to become more and more important to translation and to understanding. And we've got to think of what the implications of this are. And this is a quote from a lawyer from Nigeria. She's talking about Siri, and she's talking about how she can't find anything in her native language from Siri. It doesn't work for her. And she says, I've not seen any such application that understands many African languages. If these barriers are not eliminated, with more emphasis placed on AI development for local languages and local content, AI will aggravate the digital divide and exclude individuals from the benefits of artificial intelligence. So not only may our biases towards these standard Englishes be these assumptions be based on maybe unhealthy biases, what they also might have consequences. And I was looking at this map. Sorry, I didn't reformat it, and it's a bit messy, but the message of it is quite stark, because it's showing the artificial intelligence company count by country. And you can see in Africa, there's a huge white space where there is no AI funding, there's no AI work happening. And I think we might be playing into that with kind of going, oh, well, English is okay, or French is okay, standard varieties are okay. And what we might start doing, bringing me back to the beginning of the presentation, is aggravate the digital divide and silence other voices. So my summary at the end, and I've used nearly all my time, I think, we need to be curious about our assumptions, about the information mode our users in, about the true accessibility of apps and websites, videos, anything that uses data. We need to be critical about our assumptions we make about levels of expertise and levels of motivation. We need to really think about how people read. And we must think really carefully about whether people do prefer one language after another, and look at our evidence for this. And also whether people prefer one language or actually live in a multilingual way and in a multilingual world. So that's my presentation gone. Thank you very much, Mike, for letting me present. And I hope you found this slightly more philosophical approach interesting.
Thanks so much, Frances. That was amazing. So lots of great positive feedback in the chat here. This talk is brilliant, amazing, Francis. Where can we learn more? Asks a few people. Rahel asks about what happens when brands start translating. We're going to take a short break now, but I'm sure Francis will be happy to answer those questions in the chat on Veto. We'll see you back here at 3:30 in 10 minutes with John Wilshire, who's going to talk about Zenko mapping. Spooky.
Sure. Thank you.